Welcome everyone to this bonus section on Python GUIs or graphical user interfaces with IPyWidgets. So we're going to show you how to build simple graphical user interfaces with Jupyter. And because we're going to do this exclusively with Jupyter, that's why we consider this bonus material. There are lots of libraries out there for graphical user interfaces, each with their pros and cons. There's the built-in tkinter, which doesn't look that great, but it's built into Python. There's also solutions like PyQt, which then, if you actually want to use it as a product, there's some licensing issues you need to deal with. But there's the open source IPyWidgets and widget styling structure within Jupyter, so that's why we decided to use it for this kind of bonus material section. So we're going to explore how to build out interactive elements. These are things like buttons or sliders that you can have directly in a notebook for someone else to play around with. You're going to want to keep the lecture notebooks handy because there's a lot of reference code and information there for you. So let's get started with our very first lecture in this topic, where we're going to discuss the interact functionality. Let's open up a Jupyter notebook. Okay, so here I am at a Jupyter notebook. As a very quick note, for the notebooks that go along with this lecture that are hosted at the repo, you actually won't be able to see the sliders that we create or any of the interactive elements that we're going to be creating. That's because this is just hosting the code itself. It's not actually running it. So NBViewer or GitHub won't actually be able to execute the code here. They're just showing you the code itself. So keep that in mind if you come visit to the GitHub and you're wondering why you don't see sliders here. You need to download this notebook and run it with Jupyter Notebook in order to actually see or view the widgets and interact with them. So keep that in mind. And again, this is all under bonus material, Introduction to GUIs or GUIs. So let's get started with the interact function. In order to do that, we need to say from IPyWidgets, import interact, and you can use tab autocomplete here, interactive, and also fixed. And then we will say import IPyWidgets as widgets. So once we're done with those imports, we're going to create probably the most basic interact function. So at a most basic level, what interact does is it auto-generates a user interface control for some sort of function argument. And then it calls the function with those arguments that you can allow yourself to manipulate interactively. So to use interact, we first need to define a function that we actually want to play around with or explore. So we're going to create the most basic function possible, which is just, well, it's not the most basic function possible, but it's definitely a basic one. You take an x and we return back x. So super simple function here. And then we're going to call interact, and you pass in the function itself, and then you set some default value for the arguments of the function. In this case, there's one argument. And then when we run this, we should see a slider here. So then note how as I'm sliding, I have this x value, and this is my input x that I have highlighted here, and this is my output x. So if I scroll around or slide around, I get to see the actual results. So let's explore this concept further. Let's imagine I wanted to return the square of x. If I rerun my function and rerun interact here, now I'm returning back the square at the bottom. So I can see here as my slider goes from -7 to 25, I'm just returning the square there. So I can see here how I can vary the input and then see some corresponding output. Let's go back to that simple function where we just return x. So we saw that we get a slider when we're working with integers. Let's see what happens when we pass in booleans. So with booleans, it auto creates a checkbox, which makes sense because booleans are either true or false. So here, now we automatically created this checkbox. Mark it check for true, unmark it for false. And then if we actually pass in a string, such as hello, then I get back this auto text box. So right now, this function is just accepting x and returning x, and interact is smart enough to know what kind of feature it should show you based on the data type that's being passed. So for integers or numbers, it passes in a slider. We just saw for booleans, it passes in a checkbox, and then for strings, it passes in a little text box here. So I can type whatever I want, and you'll notice that this function is just returning x. So lots of cool functionality here. Now what we're going to do is, instead of passing in this function into interact, we can actually do all this with a decorator. So let's see how we can do that. I'm going to click exit here to kind of end this. I'll come back to a function. Let's create a new function called g. and G takes in X and Y. And then all it does, it just returns back a tuple of X and Y. Again, a very simple function. Now what we could have done is pass this function into interact again, and then provided something for X and something for Y. But we can do all of this with the decorator. And if you're unfamiliar with decorators, make sure to go back and review the decorators lecture. But there's a decorator called interact, and here we can pass in the default values that we want to start off with. So I can say something like X is equal to true, and Y is equal to a floating point, let's say 1.0. And now when I run this, I actually get back these options. So I can say true, false, notice my output here, and then I have this slider. Now let's imagine we actually wanted to keep one of these values fixed. We didn't want everything to be manipulated by the user. What we could do is pass in this parameter into the fixed function. So what we would do here is just say Y is equal to fixed 1.0, make sure my parentheses balance up. And then when you run this, you no longer have the option to pass in Y. It's been fixed at 1.0. And this also works inside the interact function. So if we rerun func here, and I say X is equal to hello, and I say fixed hello, then when I run this, I don't get the option of that text box anymore. It just fixes this parameter to always be whatever that default was. So that's how you can use the fixed function. And so now we have the interact function as well as the interact decorator. Now let's talk about widget abbreviations. Recall that when we said interact, passed in our function, and then said X is equal to, let's say, 1, we get back this value of a slider, and I can go to some minimum and to some maximum. But notice what's happening here. I can only go to a minimum of -1 and to a maximum of 3. And if I were to expand this to 10, suddenly I can go to a max of 30 and a minimum of -10. So what happens is your minimum is defined by the X and your maximum is defined by X times 3. So you may be wondering, well, how do I actually change my minimum, my maximum, and even my step size or my starting value? What you can do is instead of just saying X is equal to 10 and have it automatically create this integer slider for you, you can call widgets, int slider, and then you can pass in, if you do shift tab here and expand this, you'll actually see the arguments you can pass in. You can pass in minimum, maximum, step, and value. So let's do that as well. I remember this is an integer slider, so our step size needs to be an integer. There's also a float slider in case we want that. But now I can say my minimum goes to -100, my maximum goes to +100. We can create a step size of 1, and then our starting value of 0. So now I have all these options with the integer slider. And if I rerun this, notice I'm starting at 0, I have a step size of 1, and I can go from -100 all the way to +100. So these are the widgets that you can specifically call if you want more options in the functionality of the widgets, instead of just the ones that are auto-created for you. Now because sliders are so commonly used with widgets, there's actually ways to abbreviate all this functionality here. And the way you do that is by calling interact, pass in your function, and say X is equal to, and it's very similar to arrange. What you do is you have a tuple here where you have a min, max, and a step size. So I could say go from -100 to 100, step size of 1. And then when I run this, notice back, I get back the same thing from -100 to 100, or I can go from -10 to 10, rerun this, and here's -10 to 10, step size of 1. This is known as an abbreviation of this widget right here, because now I'm just passing in an abbreviated tuple instead of calling integer slider. This is an integer slider, and if we wanted this to be a floating point slider, all you had to do was specify one of these to be a float here. And then if we specify the rest to be floats as well, so let's say 0.1, and we rerun this, now Jupyter Widgets realizes, oh, he wants a float slider, so then we have the floating point slider here. And notice now our step size is 0.1, and we're going from -10.0 all the way to +10.0 in step sizes of 0.1. Again, using this abbreviated format. And as always, you can do this with the interact decorator as well. So if I say at interact, I could say X is equal to, and then say 0.0 to 20.0, step size of 0.5, create a function. Let's just have this function be h, and we can have some default value like 5.0, and then just return x. So then when I call it, I have the default value of 5.0. It goes down to 0.0 all the way up to 20 and step sizes of 0.5. Okay, so this is widget abbreviation again, lots of different options here. Those were the abbreviations for integers and floating point sliders. You can also have drop-down menus, and those are abbreviated as well. Remember that if I said interact, pass in my function, and I said x is equal to a string, such as hello, it just has a text box here automatically generated. So hello, how are you? And it's just returning back that string. If you pass in a list of strings as an abbreviation of a full call, it will create a drop-down menu. So we can say hello, option 2, comma, another string, option 3. And now when we run this, we get back this nice little drop-down menu. Option 2, hello, option 3. So this abbreviation of using a list with strings is a drop-down menu. And we have a little table in the notebook so you can reference this and not have to memorize what tuples stand for or what lists stand for. But when you get used to it, it's pretty straightforward. These tuples are sliders. The list with strings is going to be a drop-down menu. And there's also, when you pass in a dictionary, let me show you what happens. We'll say interact, our simple function, say x is equal to 1, 10, and then we'll say 2 goes with 20. And when you run this, you get back a drop-down menu 1, 2, but then the actual output is equal to the value here. So your drop-down menu is the key, and your output is the actual value. So notice the difference here between that list and that dictionary being passed in there. Now, in addition to this interact function, IPython, or Jupyter in general, provides another function called interactive instead of interact. And it's useful when you want to reuse the widgets that are already been produced or access the data that is bound to the user interface controls. So unlike interact, the return value of the function will not be displayed automatically, but you can display a value inside the function using ipython.display. So to show you what I mean by all this, say from ipython.display, import display, and let's create a function here. Simple function f just ticks in a and b, and then instead of just returning a plus b, we're also going to then call display on a plus b, and this will allow us to use the interactive function. So then I can set w equal to interactive, pass in f again, and we'll say a is equal to 10, b is equal to 20, and if I check what type w is, notice it's now an interactive object. So the widget is an interactive, which if you look at the documentation is a subclass of something called a VBox, which is just a container for other widgets. Now the children of interactive, if we check out the children attribute, these are actually two integer sliders here, as well as an output. So it's basically building out a larger UI for you using the interactive functionality. So then if you actually want to finally see what W actually looks like, what it was defined by this interactive function, you can call display on W. Let's make sure I spell that right. And then you get back both sliders. So you get 27, -2, and you get to see the sum. So 27 minus 2 is 25. And now you can see how we can use the interactive functionality to save something as a variable and then just display the variable later on. Okay, so that's really it for the interact and interactive functionality. Let's very briefly go over everything we just covered. The main idea here is that you're going to be able to create functions that take in some sort of input and return some sort of output. Then if you want your user to have some sort of interface to change the possible inputs and then see the outputs, you can use the interact function, or you can use the interact decorator. And then we saw how we could specify actual widgets inside of the interact call itself, and we saw how there's abbreviations for them, such as the tuple for a slider, or the list for a drop-down menu, or a dictionary for a drop-down menu that has a connection to some key value pairs. Then finally, we saw how we could use the interactive functionality in order to save this to a variable so I can later display that variable and again see the inputs and the outputs. Last thing I want to note here is when you're using the Jupyter Notebook, you may have noticed that there's this report here that the output is some sort of function. If you don't want to see that, all you have to do is have a semicolon here, and then when you run this, you will no longer see that output. And that's what's essentially happening when you call display on this W. You don't see that little output cell. Okay, we'll see you in the next lecture where we begin to discuss more capabilities of widgets.